Welcome to part 2 of our analysis, and we are going to turn our attention to cases and general comments in this part 2. The lecture is going to begin with the instruments of international and European law, just as a reminder, how analysis of case law and general comments should be conducted, and the interpretation of treaties and statutes and who actually does those types of interpretations. We, of course, at the end will have a sample passage to show us how to write when we analyze a case or general comment. Again, as a reminder, Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice tells us the sources of international law. And we can think of it like the graphic presented in this slide. And we know that treaties are the general and principal source of international law. And we looked at treaties in part 1, but we also know that treaties can be interpreted by certain bodies, including courts. And so we want to look at judicial decisions today because that forms subsidiary international law, and often the judicial decisions are in fact interpreting treaties. But we also want to take a look at general comments because the bodies that are formed inside of treaties also have the authority to interpret the provisions of the treaties. So how would you analyze a judicial decision? This is a guide, a general guide, to help you work through judicial decisions. Start with the parties and the procedural history. Who actually brought the action? How did the case come to the court? How did the court reason about that case? And perhaps the court has told you about their reasoning in a press release. Then think about the outcome and the arguments that are used to justify that outcome. There you would look at each legal issue before the court's explanation of the facts in the law and why they were important for the decision. I'm here at the website of the International Court of Justice where we'll take a look at some case law from the court and to look at how we can analyze that case law. So of course we need to find some of their cases, and we can go to the tab here and go to Judgments, Advisory Opinions, and Orders. And when we click on that, we can see judgments and advisory opinions, but I'm just going to find something that's recently been done that we can take a look at by scrolling down the page. I'm very interested in looking at this judgment of the 17th of March 2016 between the countries of Nicaragua and Colombia. So I'm going to choose the English version, which of course is bilingual in both languages, English and French. And the first thing that I'm going to look at is just asking myself whether there's a table of contents, and there is, that can give me a good overview of the whole decision. And thankfully for me, there is. So here we see that there is a chronology of the procedure, looking first at the introduction, the first preliminary objection, the third preliminary objection, the fourth, then the second, and then the fifth. So I have an idea just from the table of contents how this decision is written. I would also like to suggest that one of the things that's really important is to just nail down, if you can, the main issues that are being considered. And often that is found by just going back to your table of contents again and looking at the areas for each of the arguments. So look in the area for the first preliminary objection, find out what that was about, and then find out how the court ruled on it. And the actual rulings are usually at the bottom. So as you scroll through the case, you come down to the part where they summarize everything. And sometimes it's easy to just go down there and take a look at the summary so that you already know in advance how all of the issues have been decided. And that's usually right here in this part. So it tells you that the court unanimously rejects the first preliminary objection, tells you how many voted and who they voted and who voted against and for. And then it tells you that it rejects the fourth, it rejects the fifth. So you can already find the outcome to your issues in advance, and then you can go back and look at the reasoning. So now we go back, and the reasoning is broken down. So if you wanted to find out about the fifth preliminary objection, you can read about what each of the parties contends in this section, and then you can read about how the court reasons in this part. And so it has a logical format to it. So by going through it, looking at the table of contents first, then finding out the issues and their answers second, and then going back up and looking at the actual discussion by the court, you come to a way to analyze and understand these cases. When you interpret a treaty or a statute, of course, that interpretation can be done by a body that is designated inside the treaty to monitor the state's parties and their responsibilities. In the case of human rights treaties, this is done by a treaty monitoring body, and often these treaty monitoring bodies will issue a general comment about a section in the treaty. Here, we are going to go to the World Wide Web, look up a general comment, and understand the structure and how it's set up so that we can better know how to interpret and analyze such a document. Their general comments. So I was going to take a look at the treaty for the elimination of racial discrimination, and I wanted to see the general comment. So usually you have to scroll down the screen until you get to some general comments. Now in the CERD, that's the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, they're not called general comments, they're called general recommendations. So just recognize that some treaties call it by a different name, but it's still the same important idea that they are interpreting provisions of a treaty because they're the monitoring body. So we're just going to look at this recommendation number 35. And we have the option to look at it as a Word document or a PDF in English. So we're going to take a look at it as a PDF. And essentially, we see what it looks like a typical document from the UN. And the important thing here is to recognize that often there's background information inside of these general comments. So you can see here that they introduce it, they explain how the committee approached the drafting, and then they give the operative provisions here in part 2. So when looking at this and analyzing it, you have to recognize that you might get even additional information about why a treaty came about and what the thinking was behind the drafters. And this is really very important as you describe and analyze portions of the treaty. Here, I find it very interesting that then they talk about a specific article, Article 4, and they give their interpretation about words inside of that article. So these types of recommendations or comments are very useful if you are using persuasive arguments and you want to show that the actual monitoring body also has interpreted your idea the same way. Each and every section or important operative section of a treaty, at least in human rights, often has a corresponding general comment. So if you're writing on a provision in a treaty, it's often very important to take a look at a general comment or a general recommendation. I'm just going to scroll down to the end of this recommendation so that you see that various articles inside of the convention are discussed. And then at the end, there's sort of a summary paragraph that generally explains about racist hate speech. When you write about cases or general comments, you want to keep these 5 points in mind. First of all, think about naming the deciding court or the treaty body. Explain the function of the court or treaty body. For example, if it has the monitoring function, explain that in your statement. You would also need to explain the relevant treaty or provisions that are being interpreted. Finally, you might need to actually quote those provisions. And the last thing that you may have to do is look at how it's been interpreted by a court or by the treaty body in a general comment or in a case. Here's a sample written passage. Pause this recording to read the passage. There are examples of references to treaties as well as interpretations by a court case.